May the sacred presence of the one who said he would abide in his teachings be our guide. May we follow his glorious example and tread with unfaltering steps his noble path, until we too shall attain enlightenment. All Buddhists throughout space and time, all honored ones, bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, maha prajna paramita. Good evening. I'm so used to starting my talks that way, saying good evening and hearing everybody say good evening right back. And this is catches me every time with the Zoom talks. Nancy's waving. This is great. Thank you. I got a little bit of feedback there. That's wonderful. I believe last week you guys read the 4th chapter of Thich Nhat Hanh's Heart of Buddha's Teaching. And I wasn't there for that reading. I was in Genzaway Sesshin, so at 7:45 I was sitting on the porch outside the temple and probably watching birds and bunnies and people walking their dogs and their kids while a couple handfuls of us sat in meditation. But what I'd like to talk about tonight, since you read that 4th chapter last week, is I want to touch a little bit on lineage, sort of what lineage is and what the lineage of this particular group is in a somewhat technical sense and what it might be in a more colloquial sense, and talk about like how that relates to Thich Nhat Hanh's lineage. And some of this might be well known for some of you, and for some of you it might be new. So if you know this stuff, just coast along with me, and if it's new, perk your ears up. But I want to talk about lineage, and I want to talk about working with sutras and scriptures and how that might help or not help with modern day stresses. So in terms of lineage, my training came through Dharma Rain, and my teachers were trained at Shasta Abbey by a woman named Roshi Kennett, who was an English woman who trained at Sojiji in Japan. And the style of Zen that was transmitted is called Soto Zen. It's one of the 3 main branches of Zen in Japan. There was Soto, there was Rinzai, and then there was Obaku. And Soto Zen has a particular flavor. It's often defined in contrast to Rinzai, which is the other main flavor. Rinzai tends to be more aggressive isn't the right word, but aggressive, in that there's often either a formal koan practice with lots of embodied responses. In medieval Japan, the 2 main schools of Zen, Rinzai and Soto, were often described as Rinzai being samurai Zen and Soto being farmer Zen. Neither one is better than the other, but they have different styles, they have different flavors. Soto focuses more on shikantaza, or just sitting, or silent illumination, more of that contemplative, internally inquiring meditation. And Rinzai tends to be more koan-based, dialogue-based, choreographed, ceremony based. These are all stereotypes, by the way. These are not like defining characteristics. These are sort of terms used to commonly describe the two schools. All of those schools of Zen came from China, where they had been practiced for many, many centuries. And the Chinese Buddhism came from India. So going back in time, we come from where we are now, back through Japan, back through China, back into India over the course of 2,600 years. And through that time, all of those schools, all of those stylings of Buddhist practice interacted with other stylings of Buddhist practice. So there's a lot of crosstalk, there's a lot of cross-pollination. And yet there are still some of these defining threads that we assume we are maintaining. So Thich Nhat Hanh is a Vietnamese Zen teacher, and the Zen practiced in Vietnam, and this is also a gross generalization, this is not precise in any way, shape, or form. The lineage going back in time goes from many, many centuries in Vietnam back into China. So it came from China. It came from China probably in the early 100s. First 2 or 3 centuries. It is said that if you know anything about Mazu and Sherto, that some of Mazu's students came to Vietnam and introduced Zen there. But the Zen practiced in Vietnam and the Zen practiced in Japan didn't have a whole lot of cross-pollination. So over the centuries, there are things that stayed the same, and then there are things that are different. Some of the sort of Zen focuses on meditation only. Over the centuries, both in China and in Vietnam, were also influenced by Pure Land Buddhism, or picked up Pure Land influences. And we can see this in some of our practices today. In China, the Zen also had interactions with some Vajrayana teachings. And again, in Japan, one of our lineage ancestors, Keizan, did some training with the Japanese Vajrayana, at a Japanese Vajrayana temple. And so he picked up some of those influences as well. So all of this is just to say that in a big sense, all of these different styles of Buddhism are cousins. In a big sense, in a big, broad, real sense. We maintain an illusion that we have a particular lineage that has been transmitted down through the generations in one way. But there's still a lot of crosstalk and cross-pollination. I can say my teacher was Kyogen, and his teacher was Jiyu Kennett, and her teacher was Keto Chisan. But once we get past that living memory, it gets a little bit squishy. And over time, looking back through the histories, you'll find threads of teachings that come through that then interact with other styles of practice, either Buddhist practice or even other non-Buddhist practices. In early China, there was a lot of blending with Taoism and Confucianism. And so you'll get sort of these syncretic modes happening, and then a reformer will come along and decide, nope, we're going to bring this back to the pure style of what it was centuries ago, or what was imagined to have been the practice centuries ago. So then there's this sort of tightening up and defining. This is who we are. This is what our practice is. These are our main teachings. And that goes along for a couple of centuries, and then it starts to blend again. And we pick up different flavors and different styles. And then there's another reformer that says, nope, we're going to bring it back to the pure teaching. If you do this too many times over too many millennia, it gets really hard to distinguish what the original practices were. And we can guess, scholars can guess, they can do textual studies and guess, but it's still a guess. I can pick up a piece of Buddhist literature and say, these are the Buddha's teachings, but I can't tell you what his exact words were. I mean, the teachings as we receive them have come through multiple languages, and they've been translated multiple times. And we put our faith and trust in the fact that those translators were accurate and honest and included everything. But that's not always the case. We know that there are sets of literature that, as they were copied from scribe to scribe, teacher to teacher, century to century, gained parts, and the sutras got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then there was a period of revisions where the sutras got shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. Specifically, I'm talking about the Perfection of Wisdom scriptures, which the Heart Sutra is part of. So we've chanted the Heart Sutra. You're all familiar with that one. But over centuries, the Prajnaparamita sutras got bigger. And then they got smaller. And then they came down smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's probably not the only set of Buddhist literature that has happened to, that it got bigger and then it got smaller. So, this question of lineage, it comes down to us, it comes down to individual temples, individual teachers. Each teacher learns from their master, from their teacher. And when the master recognizes that understanding in the student, there is what's called transmission, or an authority to teach, an authority to give the precepts, an authority to take students, to train students, to make new monks, to make new temples. But each new teacher, as they take on their teaching role, has the question put to them in myriad number of ways, both explicit and implicit, of what is your teaching? What is your style? And so there's an emphasis on both honoring the tradition as it's been passed down and using your own unique voice to convey the Dharma. And so there's a little bit of a paradox there. It's tricky. It's trickier than I thought it would be. So what do we keep? What do we pass on? What do we say isn't important? What do we say is important? For example, we have our Intro to Zen Meditation Zoom coming up next week. And as we teach this meditation style to others, what do we teach? What do we keep? What do we say? I've heard people in intro workshops say, do I have to sit full lotus? Because that's what all of the statues look like when people are sitting in meditation. They're sitting in lotus. My body doesn't do that. Like, my personal body does not do that. And so part of what we teach is sit in a way that is stable and comfortable. It doesn't necessarily have to be full lotus. If you can do it, great. It's a very stable posture. But there's nothing particularly holy in our tradition about sitting full lotus. It makes me wonder, though, if 200, 300 years in the future, somebody's going to say, nope, it's time to reform, to bring it back to the original teachings. Everybody's going to learn how to sit full lotus because that's the way it was done originally. Well, maybe that'll happen, maybe that won't. As we practice in America now, a lot of teachers are looking at that. What do we keep and what do we change? How do we adapt to American culture? And how do we do this in a way that is attentive and respectful for the tradition and not just picking and choosing what we want to do because we like it or we can do it or it blends well with a Western viewpoint. Which brings me to sort of the second part I wanted to talk about, working with sutras. So this is a little bit of a not quite a 90-degree shift, but maybe a 70-degree shift, moving on to sutras. So sometimes we'll hear these words, sutra or shastra or liturgy or scripture. Sutras are considered to be the words of the Buddha. They are given that level of respect. And some sutras were written well after the Buddha's death. And sometimes we're given reasons why they are still considered sutras, even if they've been composed after the Buddha's death. And sometimes we're not given reasons. So, for example, some of the sutras were said to have been discovered, that they had been hidden away at the Buddha's death and then discovered at a later date. A gift of the Nagas or the dragons. Shastras are basically any Buddhist text that is not said to be spoken by the Buddha. Sorry, I'm looking at the window. There's a fire truck out there, but the lights aren't on, so that's a good thing. So we have sutras and we have shastras. And then we incorporate some of the Western terminology of liturgy or scripture. And liturgy is basically any sutra or shastra that we're reciting in a ceremonial way. And scripture is any sutra or shastra that we're revering as religious text. We use these words interchangeably sometimes, and sometimes we give them more weight or more meaning if we're working with them in particular ways. So sutras, being the words of the Buddha, being the words of one we consider enlightened, they're also considered to be living things, living documents, living texts. And the life of them comes through our relationship with them. So sometimes Dogen writes, we turn the sutras, and then he'll write the sutras turn us, and then he'll write the sutras turn the sutras. So there's an interaction between our minds and these teachings that we are receiving that is quite transformative and quite spectacular. And some sutras we can read and say, yes, this is it. This makes sense. This is how we should practice. This is how we should be. And some sutras require a little bit more of interpretation. And sometimes that interpretation comes from a teacher, and sometimes that interpretation comes from sitting with those teachings for years and watching how the meaning changes as our understanding of Dharma changes. So we keep coming back to these teachings again and again, and each time we return to them, there's a different self interacting with them. And so each time we see them, or read them, or hear them, or recite them, there's a new self receiving them, and a new self allowing for that transformation to happen. So if you read a sutra and you're like, I don't get it, that's perfectly okay. It's not a failure on your part. It's just a sense of, this is how I am now. Come back to it in a year, you might say, I don't get it. But it sounds something there. There's something there that I think I understand, but I can't put into words yet. Maybe you practice for another 5 or 10 years. You come back to the sutra again, like, I see. There's a little relaxation. There's a little, okay. And eventually it starts to feel like family. It starts to feel so familiar. It can be quite sweet to open up a sutra that you studied for a while and then put aside, and you come back to it. Yes, I remember you. Feels like coming home. But it's easy to fall into the trap of looking at a sutra or a scripture and using that to reinforce or validate your own view. I've certainly found myself at times saying, I want to give a talk on emptiness. Let me go find a sutra that has the passage that talks about emptiness that will make the point that I want to make. In that case, I'm using a sutra to validate my own view, which works in a talk sometimes, but when we're working with sutras as practice, there's a big question of how do we read a sutra and let it be a question and investigate into what is the sutra actually saying? What is the sutra actually teaching? And what are elements that might be cultural or might be linguistic? This comes up a lot if there's resistance to a sutra. For example, the Lotus Sutra, as it's often translated, has a lot of wordings that people tend to find difficult and challenging when they come to it the first time. There's a lot of wording around women have to be reborn as men before they can become enlightened. And, you know, more often than not, when I teach the Lotus Sutra, we have to have conversations about that because it's so shocking to stumble across it, and it can be so hurtful. People feel like they're not seen if they're not male identified and think, why do I have to be reborn as a male to become enlightened? And so at that point, there's an investigation. What is being taught? What is cultural? What if it really is as the sutra says? What if it's not as the sutra says? So in this sense, this investigative aspect of it is more important than just words on a page. So this is one of the ways that Buddhism, or the practice of Buddhism, tends to differ from other faith traditions in that it's not, here's the doctrine, your job is to believe. Here's the doctrine, your job is to profess faith in it. It's more along the lines of, here's the teachings. Where can you move with it, and where's the resistance? Oh, there's resistance. Let's examine that. Let's see what that is. Where is the stuck place? Where is something Where is there a self that's hanging on to a definition or a label or an identity? So there's all of these reminders again and again to look deeply, to question, to investigate, to lean into, to allow transformation. And sometimes it's not an easy thing to do. Sometimes it can be quite challenging. But even with that said, it's important to dive in and give it a try. I had a whole lot of respect for everybody who took the Diamond Sutra class last summer, because the Diamond Sutra is not, it's not 100% straightforward. It's not, I was going to say it's not like Dogen's Fukan Zazengi, but Fukan Zazengi itself can be dense in places and wrapped around itself in places. But when we examined the Diamond Sutra, especially when we looked at it together as a group of people who are working with this text as a religious source, there is a lot of benefit and a lot of fruitful conversations that just came out of questioning. I don't understand this. Oh, I see it this way. Oh, I see it this other way. And I encourage people to explore that. I think, if I remember correctly, I tried to provide some historical context or some linguistic context or some, this is what this metaphor tends to point at. But rarely did I ever jump in and say, this passage means this. And if I ever did that, I apologize. Because my hope is that these teachings are tools for self-discovery, tools to understand our own minds and our own experience. So coming back around to Thich Nhat Hanh, I have a great deal of respect for him in the way he has taken Dharma and made it accessible and explained it in terms that are approachable for people to encounter and begin to work with. It's not always an easy thing to do. If you've read stories of his life, he's had a very challenging, difficult life, a lot of painful experiences, and yet there's still that very visible turning towards Dharma, turning towards practice in the midst of all of these challenges being the fodder for practice. In my notes, I have his dedication to the Dharma and embodying practice is worthy of respect. So I'm glad we're reading his book. He explains things well, or at least the way his books are written explain things well. And I want to leave a little bit of time for discussion or questions, but I want to end with a mention that this afternoon I was on a Zoom call with 5 other sotos and priests, monks, and we get together once a month just to have a check-in and talk to each other about what's going on in the world, how our sanghas are doing. But one of them, Charlie Pokorny, said that we don't own this tradition, we are just caretaking it. And we are just caretaking it for the next generation. And so as long as we remember that we are not the owners of this, we will take care of it very well. And so I just love that sentiment, that we are not owners of this tradition, that we are learning it, we are being shaped by it, we are caring for it so that it can continue on. And so with that, I will say I'm done and open it up for questions or comments.
Thank you, Jyoshin. That was a great talk. So Vietnamese Zen is closer to Soto or Rinzai, or and like either, or what is Vietnamese Zen? How does it?
I would say it's its own thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I don't have a whole lot of experience with it, so I want to be very careful about making generalizations based on assumptions. So maybe I just won't answer that one.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good answer.
Yeah. I did a little bit of research into the history, but in terms of the practice flavor of it, I don't have experience of it. I know people who practice in that tradition, and I know a couple of Dharma teachers in that tradition. They're very sweet folk.
I was interested about what you were saying about the Lotus Sutra, and I always like to compare this to my understanding of Christianity and how it evolved. Mm-hmm. And so in the New Testament, you have the four Gospels, and then the next thing is Acts, and it's the Acts of the Apostles written by Paul. But one of the things I think is really funny is that they thought of themselves as just another group of Jewish people, whatever. And so they were bringing all kinds of Gentiles into these groups. And so a big question early on was, in order to belong to these groups, did you have to be circumcised? Mm-hmm. And that was rather a relieving thing that came to the conclusion that none of the men Gentiles had to be circumcised. That anyway, I think that's a little anecdote, and it's kind of funny.
It's a funny thing that cultures do, is spend a lot of time about defining who are we and who can be in our club, mm-hmm. and who is not going to be in our club.
Right.
And yeah. I think every culture does that, and in a way it's helpful, because it's helpful to know who you are and what you're about. You know, if I get a group together that is fascinated by clean, efficient database design, and other people want to join, but their thing is like building computers out of spare parts, they're both computer related, but very, very different things. So it's good to know who's in and who's out, but or who's welcome or who's unwelcome. But to be attentive to the fact that that definition can be hurtful, or can cause harm. So how we talk about it and how we define it becomes important. And cultures change. And so what one culture accepts as true and common, and this is just what people do, several centuries later might be looked down upon as provincial or out of date or barbaric, and then those judgments get placed. So then it becomes a question of interpretation. What is important is teaching, and what is cultural that can be explained away. And so it becomes important to look at those distinctions and make sure we're not making those distinctions based on what makes us personally comfortable.
I notice that, well, I believe that everybody here started with either no spiritual tradition or a different one.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have to believe that as much as we study any particular sutra and everything else, we are bringing with it either what we do believe, did believe, or what we have totally rejected, you know, and that doesn't necessarily carry on for generations, but it is, in terms of us here today, we are bringing 50 years or more of other stuff with us.
Yep. That is true. That is true. And there's and the Buddhism that we have inherited from the previous generations of Western teachers has come through particular filters where reasonable teachings were retained and other practices were discarded as superstition. Mm-hmm. And so, like, oftentimes it's important to look past what we receive as the entirety of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's so much more richness that could be there that we don't have.
The Universal Gateway chapter is an interesting example of that. Not that, I mean, obviously we haven't discarded it, but it has magical elements that I personally love, but I know that not everybody does. I really loved what you said about the study being that our understanding of the sutras comes from an interaction between our minds and the sutra. In contrast to being told, you know, these are the words of the Buddha. Believe these words because the Buddha said them. That's nice. It's a nice way to put it.
Go ahead. Well, I'm also clocking that it's 8:23. So, but ask your question, can you? Or make a comment?
Well, I was going to respond to what Teiko said. I think, Teiko, what I would add to that is something I took away from the Diamond Sutra class last summer was that my understanding was not only influenced by my personal interaction, but my interaction with you guys in the class. I still remember this moment of sitting next to Shokai, right to his left, and we were both just completely flummoxed it seemed like in a very similar way at the same moment. And that was really powerful for me to share that energy with him in that moment.
That's great. Sangha.
Yeah. All right.
Well, that energizes you more even for your class.
Shall I say the closing verse and we'll call it a night? The universe is as the boundless sky, just as the lotus is not wetted by the water that surrounds it. The mind is immaculate and beyond the dust.
Sorry.
All Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, maha prajna paramita. Thank you all. I hope you have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoshin. And thanks for jumping in, Ronnie. That was great. Thank
Yeah,
you for
sorry
doing
for
that.
the
Oh,
little hiccups.
perfect.
Oh, you did a good job.
Yeah.
Um,
Hi, Penny.
start recording.